Hi there. I actually already recorded this once, but there was something playing in the background on the computer that I didn't know about. So when I went to actually publish it, I heard myself talking over some talk show that I don't know how that happened, but anyway, it did. So what I want to do right now is I want to make a few comments about last week's subject matter, which I found fascinating to read all of your input in your comments. They were actually quite insightful, as you guys always are, actually. Oftentimes, the things that I would think to say, many of you have already gotten there first, and I am proud of you for actually taking the time and the energy to deeply reflect on the subject matter and to connect the readings with the cases and so forth. So thank you for that. The thing that kept coming up is the situation around the GMOs. And I felt that the class is conflating multiple issues, and I thought I would try to tease them apart for you. It's much more complicated than whether or not GMOs are healthy for us or not healthy for us. It goes way beyond that. And for those of you who took my environmental policy class this summer or last summer, this will all sound a little bit familiar, but I want to talk about the difference between risk assessment and risk analysis and the role of public perception in all of that. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the other considerations in terms of whether or not GMOs are something that, as a policy matter, we want to promote or we want to be more cautious about. And I'm not coming to any conclusions. I just want to give you some additional information. I also have created in the announcement a bunch of links that will lead you to read more about these things from people who actually study them for the most part. And there's a couple of things there that are a little bit less rigorously put together, but still very informative. And hopefully some of you, if you have interest, you will be able to find the answers to your questions in those links. Okay, so let's talk about risk assessment. Risk assessment is an entirely scientific, data-driven activity that basically looks at everything we know about a situation and creates experiments to test the things that we wish we knew but we don't yet, and basically and analyzes all the data that we collect, either because it's already observable or because we've created experiments that help us observe it, and comes to some conclusion about just how risky something is. In the case of the GMOs, there's been a lot of studies done, but there have also been a lot of studies that haven't been able to be done. So I've given you a couple of links that basically will show you a couple of studies that show that GMOs are completely harmless when they are used in plant life that becomes feed for animals. And I've also given you a link that talks about a major study that demonstrates that GMOs, what's the word I'm looking for? Engineered, that's the word I'm looking for, engineered into the food products that human beings eat also do not create any harm for human beings. So two things about this. One is that the other side of the story, which I've also given you a link for, is that first of all, any research that is done for these GMO type seeds has to be through a signed contract with the manufacturers of those GMO seeds. And part of it is who can do the research. And the other part of it is, are they allowed to publish their results? So those are two different questions. As you will see in the readings, there are agreements with many major universities that the academics there may, in fact, do any kind of studying that they want of the GMO seeds. However, there have been some limitations. So one of the limitations is that they can only study GMO seeds that are already being sold. They can't study GMO seeds that are being developed. So, for example, there was a GMO seed that when it grew into a plant and butterflies landed on it and did whatever butterflies do on a plant. Honestly, I don't know what that is, but it was killing butterflies. And they were able to figure that out by testing GMO seeds that had not yet been developed, and they weren't allowed to do that. That was somehow pirated GMO seeds. So there is a problem with not testing things in advance, just the way we would like drugs to be tested before they're tried on humans. There are a lot of scientists who would like these GMO seeds to be tested in advance of putting them out there, not afterwards. So that's a problem. The other problem is, well, two more. One is that if you do not work for a major university that has cut an agreement with one of these seed companies, then it's much, much harder to get permission to do the grant. And many academics do not work for one of the major universities, and they are stymied in their efforts to find out whatever it is they want to research. And then finally, the GMO companies also have the right to say that scientists who have done research under one of these agreements cannot then publish it in a peer-reviewed journal that would go out to the world. So there's an article that demonstrates from another sector of industry how that works, because it's not unique to the GMO world. And they demonstrated that there were 38, I think it was, research studies that were published in journals about a particular topic that were very pro, and 3 that were published that were against. But when they looked at the total number, there was actually 38 that were that showed that there was no problem from whatever the subject was, and 37 that showed that there was a problem. And all of those had been blocked one way or the other from getting out to the public. So it's not as simple as having one really great study that says, oh, this is okay. You have to kind of look across the board at what are they being allowed to study and what are they not being allowed to study. How much of what is studied is getting out, and what do you have to actually do, and who do you have to get approval for to do these things. So I'm not going to draw any conclusions about the studies that are out there, or about whether or not they are adequate or we are being well informed. I have given you both sides of this story, and I will let you draw your own conclusions, which I may say you guys do really well. Okay, so that is the risk assessment piece. Now let's talk about risk analysis. Risk analysis, risk assessment, they sound a lot alike, but analysis is a term that, risk analysis is a term that is not used in a scientific way, but instead it's used in a policy-making way, or actually a political way. If you think about all the different things that go into political decisions about whether or not to create a policy or a law, make something official, you know that science is just one little teeny bit of that, right? And what are the other considerations? So you've got, perception of risk, public perception. If public is pushing on legislators to do something, it probably will get done because those legislators are worried about getting support in the next election. What about competing, I don't know, things that need resources, competing priorities, let's put it that way. There's only so many resources to go around. The federal budget, as big as it is, has a lot of things pulling at it. And maybe they don't want to allocate money for a particular thing. So it doesn't have to be the federal budget. It could be the city or county or state budget. I'll give you an example. You have, if you remember all the way back, or if you've read about what happened during the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, the Federal Bureau of Engineers knew very well the state of those dams. And they had, for a long time, warned the city of New Orleans, the state of Louisiana, and whatever county that is, that there was very likely to be a catastrophic event if a hurricane hit. but the state, the county, the city did not see that as a priority for whatever reason, whether it was political pressure to do other things, other kinds of development, other uses for the funds, or whether or not just that, they were thinking something like, well, this is a 100-year flood event, and it hasn't happened for a long time, and we don't have to worry about it for another 50 years. I don't know what their considerations were, but for whatever reason, they had the scientific assessment, they had the risk assessment, they had all that information, and nevertheless, other factors impacted them, and they did not create policy that would shore up those dams until the worst happened and the damage and the lives and the property costs had already been incurred, and only then did they come in and make a decision to spend the money. And of course, they were also able to tag some federal money, and it was just kind of a cost lives for, it's a cost of lives for waiting, but apparently that was their choice. So we don't really know in certain ways what all goes into policies around things like whether or not to use to allow GMOs, but we can think about it. There are different stakeholder groups that are putting pressure on the regulators, the FDA, about this kind of stuff, and those stakeholders include agribusiness, depending on whether they are traditional agribusiness that probably wants the GMOs, or whether they are organic farms that are actually very worried about the GMOs and don't want them. There's also people who care about the health, and there's the science groups, and whoever all the stakeholders are, they're going to be beating down the doors to lobby the FDA for whatever their point of view is. And the FDA's risk analysis will, in fact, include what they know about the potential dangers, if there are any, of GMOs, and also should look at what they don't know. That's always a question. What is it that we don't know? But then they will also look at all these political and cost effectiveness elements. And you have to also think, if they create new laws, they also need money and people to enforce those. And of course, that's another consideration. So anyway, risk analysis is basically it's what happens when you take everything into consideration, and it doesn't matter how dangerous we know something might be. And I'm not saying GMOs are, but just, harking back to the Katrina discussion, even when something's very, very dangerous, other things, we're human and we make decisions, and other things may take priority for us. Okay, so now let's talk about the public perception of risk. We've done some reading, and so we know that in Europe, the public perception of risk from GMOs is much higher than the American perception of risk. The people who are worried about GMOs in America number a smaller group than the people who are worried about that in Europe. And that's about the spread of information and the framing of information and what people have come to believe. If they are safe in America, they are safe in Europe. If they are dangerous in Europe, then they are dangerous in America. But what people think and how big of a problem something is actually in large part impacts that risk analysis that we were just talking about. For example, if you think about it, the chances of a terrorist event happening in an airport is actually relatively small, notwithstanding that we've seen this horrible, horrible event in Las Vegas the other day. These events don't happen that often. And yet we are all so afraid of them as a public that we have pushed many, many resources into security. And that's why when you go to the ball game or you go to any kind of event, we now have, what are those security things, electronic things that we have to walk through, and they take our purse and look in our purses and our bags and they run a wand down our pockets and whatever. I understand that each of those security gates, whatever they're called, the little things that we walk through, cost approximately $10,000. So if you think about how many of those you might have seen at the last event you are at, that is a choice that is costing an awful lot of money. And yet public perception requires that we protect people. And I think, after the Las Vegas thing, you're going to see hyped security and a lot more cost and higher ticket prices because of it, which means that it will be out of reach for a lot of people, probably me included, to go to concerts from now on. So anyway, you have to think about all that stuff. So public perception of risk in Europe, for example, makes it much harder to sell GMO products than it does here in America. So that's just another piece of it, is public perception. All right, now let's go actually to what we do and don't know about GMOs. And I've mentioned some of this in passing, but let me just make a little list of it. So first of all, the question of what is being studied and what isn't being studied is out there. I think I already mentioned that in order to study, you have to have certain permissions, and that scientists are not allowed to study the seeds that have not yet been put out there. Although some of them have gotten out one way or the other, kind of over the dead bodies of the manufacturers, there's information we don't have. So to the extent that studies that are already out there are actually rigorous and have been well done, we have information. But to the extent that studies have not covered certain areas, then we don't have any information at all. And again, to the extent to which studies that haven't been favorable have been deep-sixed by the seed companies, and we're not sure even how many those might be. We know that the agreements are out there, and one of the links that I gave you actually shows an agreement and all of the restrictions on it. It's actually one of the legal documents that I was able to find on the web. So that's very interesting. So the point is, we don't have all the information because we're not allowed to do all the research. And then there are disagreements about whether the research that is done that shows that GMOs are not dangerous to feed animals when their food is raised through GMO seeds, and they're not dangerous to human beings when their plants that we eat are raised through GMO means. There's like a group of 300 scientists that basically have signed a document, written a memo that says that the other scientists that did the "this is safe" studies are all connected too closely in one way or another with the companies that make the GMOs, and consequently are suspect and shouldn't necessarily be taken seriously, and all the reasons why. So which side do we believe? Honestly, I am not in a position to make a judgment. I haven't studied it. If I took it on as a project, I might be able to give you more advice. But my main recommendation is for you to know that when you see something that's controversial, that you should look at both sides, and you should find credible sources from both sides, and then do the best you can to make your own judgment. All right, so we don't know whether or not people's relationships with these companies impact what we know. So that's one thing. All right, then there are some indirect impacts that aren't even raised when we talk about, is it healthy for us to eat or not? So one of those is pollination of GMO plants. You know how things pollinate. They take to the wind in the form of seeds, or they are pollinated by birds that eat things and then poop them out later, and bees that get in and then. So anyway, one of the articles I gave you talks about, I think one of the articles, I'm not sure if I gave it to you or not, but regardless, one of these articles that I read, whether it's there or not for you, talked about something that was up close to the Canadian border on the American side that was planted officially, and then they found it growing all the way down in Nebraska, which shows you just how far these things travel. Now, what big deal is it if these GMO pollinators actually land in another field and create stuff? Well, okay, so here's the thing. Multiple deals. So what if you are an organic farmer and you're trying to assure your purchasers that you don't have any GMOs that you're selling? Well, how can you be assured of that if these things are landing in your field through no fault of your own and you don't have any idea? What if your stuff cross-pollinated with somebody's GMO stuff? So that's one thing. Another thing is, what if you harvest the seeds from your crop and then you replant them next year? Well, a couple of problems with that if they've cross-pollinated with GMO plants. So some GMO plants actually are engineered to be sterile, to have seeds that are sterile for whatever reason. I won't go into the reasons so much, but if that's the case, then cross-pollinating with your crops that you usually collect your own seeds and then plant them again might mean that the result is that your own plants are sterile and your seeds are sterile. And then you've been damaged and suddenly have a new expense of having to buy new seeds. The other case is that some GMO crops are not sterile. In fact, a lot of them are not. But because they were engineered, it's almost impossible to know if the next generation is going to be, is going to carry traits of the engineering genes that are put in or the old plant. And so you don't know what you're going to get with the seeds. Whereas if you're harvesting seeds from something you've grown over and over again, you know exactly what you're going to get. Okay, so another indirect effect is directly related to this whole seed business. And this has more to do with practice in foreign countries, particularly third world countries. There have been a lot of impacts in third world countries from GMOs that were indirect and unexpected. And some actually that were contractual, not contracted like disease, but contracted, although kind of diseasey. So let's start with the contracted. In some of these foreign countries, they have actually created regulations. We don't have these in America, but regulations that basically say that farmers are no longer allowed to collect their own seeds. And that kind of forces farmers into GMO seeds. Well, you can imagine that that adds an entire level of cost to farming costs in some of these third world countries where people are very, very poor to start with, and they don't really have the money to buy seeds every single year. And in fact, I've given you an article about how this has impacted some farmers in India where before GMO, farmers never committed suicide, and now there's a lot of farmers committing suicide because they find that they're going to go under financially, and for some reason that is their response to it in India. Similarly speaking, there are other indirect costs. Let me think if I can remember what they are. So problems with seeds. I can't think of them all right now. But anyway, I left the links for you for a bunch of indirect costs that weren't there, that aren't things that we thought about that might happen. So impacts on seeds for growing. Yeah, I can't remember what the other one was, but you'll see them. Anyway, I think the main point that I'm making is it's really very complicated and it's very, very nuanced. And how policymakers come down on all this will depend on a lot of things. And there is a lot of information for them to consider. So I don't want you to think that it's black and white. It's not just about health. It's also about cost of doing business. It's also about having your organic or other crops imposed upon by these GMO seeds. It's also about what do we really know. We need to know more than we're currently researching, or do we have enough information? Sorry about all the dog stuff. I have a neighbor who feeds feral cats. We have eight. She doesn't let them in her house, so she's not technically an indoor cat lady, but she feeds 8 feral cats that she has actually captured, had neutered, I'm happy to report, or spayed, and then released. But instead of just letting them catch the mice and other critters in the neighborhood, she feeds them. So my doggies go crazy. All right. Anyway, that is what I wanted to share with you. I wanted to give you some more information about the GMOs, and I've given you a whole bunch of links so that you can read more about it if you are interested in it. And I just want to say that absolutely every issue that we study that has to do with sustainability or environment, or actually any topic, education, healthcare, whatever, is really much more nuanced than the political people who frame it make it out to be. There is the actual assessment that has to do with all the factual data and I'll just give you one little non-environmental, non-sustainability, but just because I want you to see how this really works. Right now we're all talking about school vouchers and whether it's great to have school vouchers and charter schools or whether we need to support our public schools. And one of the arguments for vouchers is that people in poor areas with bad schools should be allowed to send their kids to other places. Well, if you actually, that's a great argument, right? I mean, I think it sounds good on the face of it. But if you drill down and look at the actual data that they have been studying over the years that there have been charter schools, which is about a decade and a half now, I think, across the states that have had them for the longest, you will find out that the vouchers for charter schools or going to whichever school you want to go to do not cover the full cost of those schools. And so in particular, you see data that shows that students from poor areas that accept the vouchers and then move on to a school of their choice, a large majority of them cannot afford all of the extras that go with that or do not get their full tuition paid or whatever, and in the end have to go back to their original school. Somehow, in a lot of places, once a school has lost its funding, it doesn't get it back, even if the student returns for a couple of years, and it makes it very, very hard for public schools to plan their budgets because they don't know how many people are going to leave and how many people are going to how many people are going to leave for some private school or charter school, and how many people are going to actually be there, so they don't actually know how much money to count on. Now, does that mean we shouldn't have charter schools or we shouldn't have vouchers or we shouldn't have private schools? Probably not. But it does mean that for us to make good policy, we should not rely on political framing, but we should drill down into all of the nuances and the actual facts of the situation and bring those to the table when we are trying to figure out policy that will work. If we just naively make policy based on black and white political framing, we are likely to get a program that doesn't work. Anyway, I've talked enough. This is like close to 30 minutes, but I hope that some of that gives you a little bit more of a window into the different factors that go into these decisions. It's not just science, even though sometimes I wish it was. It's also a lot of prioritizing, resource allocation, policy making, public perception of risk, and so on and so forth. I will see you on the boards.